But how do the other characters compare? There aren't a whole lot of them, but let's take a look. Most of the other characters in Morgenstern's story are just bit parts: Miracle Max, Valerie, the albino, and so on. And in general, they fall into the same category as the villains. They're funnier in the movie, but they're more interesting in the book. We get to see just how insecure and frightened Miracle Max is of failing at another miracle after being fired. We get to see how supportive Valerie is as she pushes him into performing said miracle. And we get to see how sympathetic the albino is to Wesley's plight. But, to be honest, they really aren't in the story enough to carry a whole lot of weight in this category. That's right. This category isn't really about the other characters in the Wesley Buttercup story. It's about the characters in the other story.
The other...
Because in both its literary and its cinematic incarnations, The Princess Bride is a story within a story. The external story of the movie is pretty simple. A grandfather comes over and reads the story of The Princess Bride to his sick grandson. Over the course of the reading, which he somehow manages to finish in just one day, we see the grandson grow more and more attached to the characters and the story. So really we only see these two characters, portrayed by Fred Savage and Peter Falk, but we form an attachment to them because most of us probably have memories of being read stories like this by our parents or grandparents, to say nothing of falling in love with said stories. Now, these characters are meant to represent William Goldman as a child and his father when he read him the story, but... I'm sorry, Hatter, I'm really not sure what you're looking for here. The other story. You know, Goldman hearing the story as a kid and giving the book to his son and finding all the changes that his father made. You did read the stuff in italics, didn't you, Matt? Of course I did, but are you talking about the stuff that actually happened? Yes, Matt. The stuff that actually happened. They're still characters in a story, so tell us about them. Okay. Well, in that case, the book definitely has more characters. We have Goldman as a child and his father reading him the story, of course, but we also have Goldman as an adult, his wife, his son, his agent, all the people in his life, and also, to a certain extent, S. Morgenstern himself. Even though we don't actually meet S. Morgenstern, we read his writing and we learn more about him, his writing style, and his personality. There's a lot more going on in the book story, and therefore there are a lot more characters. However, because of the nature of the composition, which will naturally be discussed more during composition, the characters don't really develop. Goldman learns about how life isn't fair through this story, but that's really about it. And, to be perfectly honest, I don't really like these characters that much. I find Goldman's casual way of talking about his family problems to be a little off-putting, bordering on tasteless. Now, I like the scenes with young Goldman and his father, the same scenes that we see in the movie, but that's really about it. In the end, even though there aren't as many of them, I feel more of an attachment to the characters in the movie than I do to the characters in the book. Also, the Fred Savage character actually has character development throughout the movie. He starts out treating his grandfather's story with complete indifference, and then throughout the movie we see him grow more and more in love with this story and these characters. And Peter Falk's dry humor is enough to balance out anything that might be annoying about the Fred Savage character in the beginning. These two are really what make the movie work for me, so it's not in number but in quality of character that these two get the point. But how do exact numbers and parenthetical statements stand up against matte paintings and 80s synthesizer music? My, what a strange statement. Imagery. Morgenstern has a very detailed style of writing. Everything is very precise and mathematical. Buttercup isn't just one of the most beautiful girls in the world, she actually has a ranking and she slowly works her way up to the #1 spot. Inigo, similarly, is ranked with his swordplay ability. We have Prince Humperdinck and his elaborate and detailed Zoo of Death. And in the final scenes we have a to-the-minute play-by-play of what's going on. All to lend credibility to the fact that it actually happened. He also uses parenthetical statements to try to roughly place the story somewhere in time. Though, exactly when the story takes place is still unclear. It is, however, possible to have too much detail, and the book on occasion gets bogged down in it. The details are still entertaining to read, don't get me wrong, but at times you really wish the story would move forward a little quicker. A good example of this is the sword fight between Wesley and Inigo, considered by some to be one of the greatest sword fights in cinematic history. And by some, I mean me. Come on, this sword fight is really freaking cool. While the movie presents us with an exciting fight with clever banter, the book scene gets bogged down as we're taken through every single play of the swords. In the movie, this is part of the banter,
the rocky terrain.
and it's funny.
Naturally, you must expect me to attack with Capaferro.
Naturally,
but I find that Tybalt cancels out Capoferro. Don't you?
That being said, though, the movie didn't really offer anything innovative or new in its imagery. We have what we need for the story to progress, but nothing really stands out. Unless you count the very 80s soundtrack. Don't get me wrong, I love the music, but good God is it synthesized. The book, on the other hand, was just fun to read for how absurdly detailed it was. So in the end, yeah, exact numbers and parenthetical statements do beat out matte paintings and 80s synthesizer music. But what about the unique story within a story way these stories are put together? Let's see how many times I can put story in one sentence as we look at composition. The movie's way of presenting this story is actually pretty straightforward. Just like with the Inkheart trilogy and the Neverending Story, we've got two different stories here. The fantasy story that takes place in another world, and the real world where the fantasy story is being told. But unlike the other two stories I mentioned, here, the two stories don't cross. In the movie, it's simply a grandfather telling a story to his sick grandson, a story that's been passed down from generation to generation. Every so often, the grandson will interrupt his grandfather because he read something wrong, or he read something that the grandson didn't like.
Is this a kissing book?
So it presents us with the common experience of having a story read aloud and becoming deeply invested in the characters and the plot. And it's a pretty good way to adapt the fascinating way that the story is presented in the book. When William Goldman first heard the story as a child, it quickly became his favorite, but he didn't actually read the story until he wanted to give a copy of the book to his son. When his son didn't seem the least bit interested in the story, he looked and discovered that his father had either changed or omitted quite a bit from Morgenstern's original version. This abridgment, then, not only puts an out-of-print and very difficult-to-find story back in wider circulation, but it also presents us with the story that Goldman fell in love with, and the story that he hopes that we might fall in love with, without the boring parts that Morgenstern put in there for the sake of satire or historical accuracy. Goldman also annotates these cuts in italics, so if you're curious as to what the cuts were and why they were made, you can read those sections, but if you're just interested in the straightforward story, you can skip those sections. That's it? That's all you're gonna say? Well, it's an annotated abridgment, Hatter. There's really not that much more to say. Are you seriously going to not talk about one of the most creative and innovative ways to tell a story just so you can keep up this delusion that S. Morgenstern is the real author of this book? Hatter, Morgenstern is the author of the book, and all you have to do is read any decent text on Florinese history, and you'll see that— Alright, that's it. I know I'm going to be throwing this around, but you are not getting out of this until you get sensible and actually talk about the composition of this book. What do you— What the— So what about the composition? Oh my god, this is so freaking cool! This is right up there with the composition of the Inkworld trilogy and the Neverending Story, except in this case, the two stories don't cross, and Goldman actually writes the story as if it was written by a guy named S. Morgenstern, and all Goldman did was abridge it and add commentary. And we don't just get the things that Goldman cut, we get the whole storyline of him being read the story as a child, the same storyline that we see in the movie, of Goldman finding the story and discovering that it wasn't what he thought it was, and of S. Morgenstern actually writing the story, all written as if it actually happened. Which separates this story from its author in a much more literal way than most stories are separated from their authors. And unlike the movie, we get to hear the differences between the story that Goldman heard as a child and the original story that Morgenstern wrote, which helps to bring home the life isn't fair theme that is echoed in both book and movie. Life isn't fair. Sometimes bad things happen, sometimes people die, sometimes things don't go according to plan, sometimes things drag on in an incredibly boring manner, and things don't always have a happily ever after at the end. But Goldman's father reads the story in such a way to make life seem a little fairer, just like all stories everywhere do. It's an incredibly creative and subtle commentary on the role of stories and storytelling. On its own, the internal story is a fun story. It's a little ridiculous and a little unrealistic, but it's ultimately fun to read. But this right here, this is what makes the story work as well as it does, and I absolutely love it. Composition for the win! Thank you. What just happened? You won round 5. I did? But, I mean, there's really not that much— You won! Go with it! Okay.